Okay, we've talked a little bit about, or a lot about OSPF version 2, which is the IPv4 version of the OSPF protocol. Now let's look a little bit at OSPF version 3, which is the IPv6 version of the OSPF protocol. They work very similar. Similar to your IPv4, OSPF version 3 exchanges routing information to populate the IPv6 routing table with remote prefixes. OSPF version 2 runs over the IPv4 network layer, communicating with other OSPF IPv4 peers and advertising only IPv4 routes. Now with IPv version 3, it has the same functionality, but it uses the IPv6 as the network layer transport, communicating with OSPF version 3 peers and advertising IPv6 routes. Also, your OSPF version 3 uses SPF algorithm as the computation engine to determine the best path throughout the routing domain. And with all of IPv6 routing protocols, OSPF version 3 has separate processes from its IPv4 counterparts. These processes and operations are basically the same as the IPv4 routing protocol, but they run independently. And version 2 versus version 3 each have separate adjacency tables, and OSPF topology tables and IP routing tables, because when you've done the IP routing tables before, you only see whichever version you're looking for. The OSPF version 3 configuration and verification commands are also similar to those that we used with OSPF version 2. Okay, let's look at the similarities between version 2 and version 3, and I'm going to refer to them as version 2 and version 3 so that I don't get my tongue tied as much. With link state, version 2 and 3 are both classless link state routing protocols. The routing algorithm for 2 and 3 use the SPF algorithm to make routing decisions. Metric is used. The RFCs for both 2 and 3 define the metric as the cost of sending packets out the interface. 2 and 3 can be modified using the AutoCost reference, bandwidth, router configuration mode command, and the command only influences the OSPF metric where it's configured. Okay? So if it's configured on 3, it doesn't affect 2. It's only the one that it's configured with. With areas, the concept of multiple areas in version 3 is the same as in version 2, and multi-areas that minimize link state flooding and provide better stability with OSPF domains. Your OSPF packet types, version 3 uses the same 5 basic packet types as version 2. You have your hello, your DBD, LSR, LSU, and LS acknowledgements. You have your neighbor discovery mechanisms. The neighbor state machine, including the list of OSPF neighbor states and events, remains unchanged. 2 and 3 use the hello mechanism to learn about its neighbors, its neighboring routers, and form adjacencies with them. However, version 3, there is no requirement for matching subnets. Okay, because remember that's the difference. Some of the differences between of IPv4 and IPv6. The DR and BDR election process remains unchanged in version 3, and then your router ID, both with version 2 and 3, use a 32-bit number for the router ID represented in dotted decimal notation. Typically, this is the IPv4 address. Your OSPF router ID command must be used to configure the router ID, and the process in determining the 32-bit router ID is the same in both protocols. Now let's look at the differences. Advertises. OSPF version 2 advertises IPv4 routes. Version 3 advertises routes for IPv6. Source address. Version 2 messages are sourced from an IPv4 address of the exit interface. With version 3, the OSPF message are sourced using the link local address of the exit interface. All OSPF router multicast addresses. With version 2, it uses 224.0.0.5. Version 3 uses FF02:5. So those you need to keep in mind. With your DR and BDR multicast addresses, OSPF version 2 uses 224.0.0.6. Version 3 uses FF02:6. With your advertised networks, version 2 advertises networks using the network router configuration command. Version 3 uses the IPv6 OSPF process ID area ID interface configuration command. With IP Unicast routing, it's enabled by default for IPv4. The IPv6 Unicast routing global configuration command must be configured. With authentication, version 2 uses either plain text authentication or MD5. Version 3 uses the IPv6 authentication. Now, if we look at the OSPF version 3 packet destination, some of the things we need to keep in mind is that routers running a dynamic routing protocol such as the OSPF exchange messages between neighbors on the same subnet or link. Okay? Your routers only need to send and receive routing protocol messages with their directly connected neighbors. So only if they're connected to each other are they going to send information back and forth. With your IPv6 link local addresses, it's only going to send information to the link, to that link local. It's not going anywhere else. It's hanging out there on the link local. With your source IPv6 address, this is the IPv6 link local address of the exit interface, and then your destination IPv6 address for the OSPF version 3 packets can be sent to a unicast address using the neighbor IPv6 link local address. That way it's only going to where it's needing to go. Now, you're going to configure your OSPF version 3 a little bit differently than you do version 4, just because there's a little bit difference in the commands. So you notice that our topology still looks the same. Here we have our IPv6 unicast routing. Remember, we had to have that enabled. We go to our interface. You've got your description. You've got your IPv6 address. You've done the no shutdown. You've done that also with your serial interface, both of those, and you've given it all the information it needs. Now, you need to enable your IPv6 unicast routing, configure your link local addresses, configure a 32-bit router ID in OSPF version 3 router configuration mode. Using the router ID RID command, you're going to configure an optional routing specific such as adjusting the reference bandwidth if you need to. You're going to configure the OSPF version 3 interface specific settings such as adjusting the interface bandwidth there as well. And then we're going to enable IPv6 routing by using the IPv6 OSPF area command. Okay, so those are the 6 steps that you're going to need to go to when you're setting up your OSPF version 3. Now, after you have your interfaces completely set up, we're ready to go ahead and configure OSPF. So we do the IPv6 router OSPF 10. As in 4, we did just router OSPF 10. Here we're going to have to say IPv6 router OSPF 10. We give it its router ID. This one we're going to say autocost, reference bandwidth. You give it that information. And you'll notice that everything comes up. It's going to show you here as it comes up. And then you can do show IPv6 protocols. And it's going to tell you which protocols are up and working.